which is a charitable trust. It's an NGO, and we have been working in the space of health, climate change, mental health. And today's session is really about talking about mental health stress induced by climate change, by disasters, and the space we're in, where we need to understand from one another, from academics, from practitioners, on what are some of these issues around this nexus of mental health, physical health, migration, and climate change. So today's session, we are going to be hearing from a number of academics and practitioners on their experience, on research that have been conducted on these issues. And following that, we're going to have lengthier discussions to really to take forward this agenda. How do we include this in policy? How do we include this in design, in our interventions? And so, we look forward to engaging with our audience, where I know many of you also have been working in this space. And so this is really a dialogue that we want to promote, where we talk about these issues around mental health and climate change and migration. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce each. We have a number of speakers, so I'll just give a brief about the speakers when I introduce them to come and give their. And before that, I would like to invite our one of my colleagues, Julfikar Haider, to really first engage with yourselves in our audience. We have a few questions that we wanted to ask you around these issues, and then I will go on to introduce our speakers as well as our discussants, and we'll get started then. So Julfikar, I'm going to pass on to you now.
Yeah, thank you, Samyappa. So let's start the ice-breaking session. Now I am presenting the Mentimeter, and you have to type www.menti.com, and which I also typing in the chat box, and then you have to type the code. So our code is 73971134.
Can you put that on the chat?
Yeah, sure. 73 and 971134. 73971134. So here is the code, and so feel free to answer the question. I'm presenting the slide.
Are you sharing this on screen? I can't.
Yeah. Okay, I'm sharing the screen.
Yeah, you can see.
Yeah.
So if I wonder, everybody in the audience understood that this is the question: what are some of the mental stresses caused by climate change? And we'd like you to go to type in Menticom and use the code and submit your answers.
Yeah. Okay. Depression.
A little challenge. Where is the board that I can put my?
So are you on a web, on the website, Menti?
www. You have to type.
Okay. No, but where do I? I can see the slide as well. I'm just wondering how to put in my comment.
The one, can you put in the code and you're?
Yeah, I'm saying other people. I
have to open a new Windows. You need to open a new Windows and need to type www.menti.com and then use this password that's shared by Julfikar.
I am already in. I just want to put in the word my.
Oh, and it's not giving the option?
How do I? Okay, never mind. Go ahead.
Okay.
How many answers were you able to
So,
get?
yeah, we have a lot of answers: frustration, hopelessness, grief, and very good. Existential crisis. It's great answer.
Can't
So,
read what's on the side here on the
yeah, less sleep,
yeah.
less sleep, and someone typed
Interestingly, this is it's a word cloud, right? So people, most of the
PTSD.
answers has been around depression, PTSD. So these are really, as we're seeing these answers, I think all of us can relate, or from the work that we've been doing, whether it's around, vulnerability, resilience, gender, disaster reductions. We have been seeing, people expressing a lot of these responses, in our own research, but to better understand how, we address these, like whereas depression and anxiety possibly are, two different ways of dealing with it, and, what's causing what. So that's really our agenda today, to bring some of these on the forefront, and also how do these differ, or how do these relate to the different issues around migration, around long-term adaptation, around sudden shock. So that's what we're going to try and understand from today's session. So thank you for joining in and sharing with us your thoughts. Decreased well-being, absolutely. Well-being is again another area, nexus area, where we're trying to understand, what does well-being actually mean to people. So if you want to move to the next answer, next question, the second question.
Before moving to the next one, we can ask Farah about what actually she want to share.
Absolutely, Appa, is it?
As like she were not able to
add what word?
No. I mean, I would have added all of this. So if there's anything missing, I mean, that I'll speak to. It's okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Appa.
Okay, so we can move to the next question. Where is it?
Yep, it's come up. Big yes.
So the next question is, does news media make people more uncertain and stressed regarding climate change? So
I love that it's one, and I don't love it, but it's just one big yes, because again, we're also wanting to understand. So one thing we're trying to, oh, okay, that's great to know. I definitely feel personally stressed, just hearing the wide range of issues and uncertainties around, when we hear about different impacts and issues around climate change. So I think that space itself on how, we deal with it as well, with all the uncertainty and the changing dynamics, is also something that can be addressed, that we also need to think of our mental well-being as we, work in this space. So, and we have a few solutions or suggestions that we'll be talking about at today's session on how do we work with the frontline workers, the people who have been working with the communities that we want to that we want to work with to reduce their impacts and make them more resilient. So that's the reason we asked this question as well. Right, I think we can now. Yeah, you have. I think, I don't think we're going to get any more. So yes, big yes, it does make people uncertain and stressed. We have a few no's, and nuance is another. It's it changes. I mean, it's not just black and white. It's another way of looking at it. Thank you.
Okay, so I think I can hand over my colleague, Dr. Samia Salim, to continue the next session.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to get started with what we're going to hear today. At first is so there has been some some studies carried out around impacts of climate change on health and mental health as well. So we're going to be hearing first of all today from Ifat Mahmood. She's a public policy practitioner focused on human development and is a senior operations officer at the World Bank Health, Nutrition, and Population Global Practice. She'll be joined by her colleague as well, Wamek Raza, who is a health and nutrition specialist within the World Bank's Health, Nutrition, Population Global Practice in Bangladesh. And they'll be talking about a Bangladesh-wide study that was done around impacts of climate change on health and mental health. So I'll hand over now to you. If I don't know who's going to go first, or if you're going to just follow one another or speak together, but I'll hand over to you, Ifat, to give us your presentation.
Thanks. Yeah, we'll speak together. I mean, we've divided up the presentation. So thank you very much for inviting us. I'm Ifat Mahmoud, the Senior Operations Officer at the World Bank. And we are very pleased to share with you the findings of this piece of work that we did last year to assess the linkage of climate change on human health effects. And during today's session, we'll specifically focus on mental health issues, how it can play with your mood, as the title says. In terms of the outline of the presentation, next one. We'll provide some context to the report. This is based on a survey, as you've mentioned, that we got done in 2019 and 2020, covering the monsoon in 2019 and the dry season in 2020, and also analyzing existing information that we already have, literature review and data recorded by the Bangladesh Meteorological Department. So we'll talk a little bit about how the climate has already changed in Bangladesh over the last 100 years, share the findings of the survey in terms of the effect of climate change on mental health, and then provide some recommendations, food for thought. Next, please. So in terms of setting the context, as I mentioned, we looked into the data collected by the Bangladesh Meteorological Department. And what we have found is that the temperature for Bangladesh has increased by 0.5 degrees Celsius already. And as we know, in the Bangla calendar, there are 6 different seasons, but because of the erratic pattern of temperature and rainfall changes, this seasonality is getting blurred. We'll talk a little more about that. And then what it means in terms of the mental health of people, we found that people are usually more depressed in the dry season than in monsoon. And with increasing humidity, we found that people generally experience more anxiety and depression. Dhaka and Chattogram, the 2 big metropolises, we found that the rates of depression and anxiety was the highest amongst the entire country. And women generally feel less anxiety than men, and the depression levels were comparable across the 2 groups. So to look a little bit more into how the climate has already changed in Bangladesh, as I mentioned, temperatures increased by 0.5 degrees Celsius. And we see the temperature has increased for every month, and the largest increments were recorded for February and November. So this essentially means that summers are hotter and longer, and winters are also getting warm. In terms of rainfall, this is also quite interesting because we see that for the peak monsoon period of June to August, average rainfall has declined by about 60 millimeters between 2019 and 1901. On the other hand, average rainfall for September and October has increased substantially by 43 millimeters. So this means that when rainfall starts in February or March, the monsoon is essentially extended up to October. And that's why we said that the seasonality is getting blurred because we don't see the distinct features of each season. Next, please. So when we look at humidity levels, that has already changed, but it is not uniform across the country. As you see in this slide, on the left-hand side, we present data from 1980. And on the right-hand side is 2019. And you would see, because of the changes in color, the north, northeast, and southern parts of Bangladesh have experienced more humidity in this period of time. And the rest of the country has remained pretty much the same. So in terms of, so this is setting the context in terms of saying how climate has changed. Now I will hand it over to my colleague Wamek to share with you some of the findings from the survey.
Thanks, Ababa. Thanks for inviting us to be here. So I'm going to get into a little bit of the details of the survey here. So the panel survey that we conducted across the country. Am I audible? Okay, perfect. So the panel survey that we conducted took place during the peak of the monsoon, which is between August and September in 2019, and at the peak of the dry season between Jan and Feb. And we collected 2 rounds of data from about 3,600 households, which is roughly about 15,000 individuals. And the survey itself is representative, not only at the national level, but also separately for urban and rural areas. And within the urban areas, we separately have representation for Dhaka and Chattogram cities, which is why we're able to estimate their figures separately. We used a structured questionnaire. I mean, it had a standard battery of questions, including individual household characteristics, community characteristics, some illness data. But what is specifically of interest to this presentation is we included a locally validated set of mental health questionnaires, which is the PHQ-9 and GAD-7. So when we talk about mental health, particularly in the context of this presentation, we're specifically talking about depression and anxiety disorder. So just to clarify for the audience, I mean, what is depression? It's essentially a mood disorder that leads to a continuous feeling of sadness, blues, loss of interest in day-to-day activities, abnormal sleep patterns, and so forth. The anxiety disorder, on the other hand, I mean, anxiety is a natural reaction to stress. But when it persists, when it continues on and on, it turns into a disorder, a perennial disorder. And it can cause persistent nervousness, stress, irritability, and unexplained worry, and so forth. So given this and the household survey I just described, so what do we find? So in terms of seasonality, when it comes to mental health illnesses, particularly for depression, we see that depression disorders are about 22% higher during the dry season than during the monsoon. Whereas for anxiety, it's higher during the monsoon. It's about 15% higher during the monsoon than in the dry season. Now, in terms of geographic spread, where are people more vulnerable? Depression, as my colleague Ifat mentioned earlier, depression is by far the highest in the metropolises, Dhaka and Chattogram cities. But whereas for the rest of the country, it remains relatively comparable. Anxiety follows similar trend. It's the highest in Dhaka and Chittagong cities. And unlike depression, the second highest, again, is in all urban areas, whereas it's the lowest in rural areas. So there must be something about the urban dynamics that is causing people anxiety. So when we break it down, the prevalence by demographic characteristics, see that depression is very strongly inversely related to age. So people who are elderly are about 6 times as more likely to be depressed than the youngest age group. Whereas we don't find any difference across genders. In terms of anxiety, however, I mean, much like depression, the elderly, again, once more, are significantly more stressed than the younger age groups. But when we look at the gender divide, men in general tend to be more prone to anxiety disorders than women. So next, we ran some models to kind of assess the correlationship with weather variables and weather variability, particularly in the context of climate change. So when we run these models, in terms of depression, we see that increasing mean temperature by, say, 1 degree Celsius lowers the probability of someone having a depressive disorder by 1.6 percentage points. Whereas for anxiety, like a 1% increase in humidity increases the probability of someone having an anxiety disorder by 0.3 percentage points, and 1 degree Celsius increase in mean temperature increases the probability of having an anxiety disorder by 0.8 percentage points. So what do these all matter? I'm going to pass it back to my colleague Ifat to kind of tie up. Thank you.
Thanks, Wamek. So next, please. As you've seen, there is considerable association between climate change and mental health. So with climate further projected to worsen for Bangladesh, the effect on mental health will be more. Temperature, for example, is projected to increase by another 1.4 degrees Celsius around 2050, and rainfall overall is expected to increase by 74 millimeters around 2040, 2059. So it really is the time to act now. First, to mainstream the response to mental health, because as we know in Bangladesh particularly, mental health issues are largely ignored. People don't want to talk about that. So we need to mainstream the response. One way could be to train non-specialists so that they are able to detect and treat common disorders at the primary level, so to speak. Second, there's a need to further strengthen that by raising awareness and providing and giving more priority to groups of people who are more vulnerable, as we've learned from Wamek's slides, that women, the elderly, and people from the poorer segments of the population are particularly vulnerable. And then creating peer support groups might help the elderly people in particular to deal with their depression and the feeling of loneliness. These are just some food for thought that we wanted to share with you for further discussion. And with that, we invite you to read through our entire series, which is called Climate Afflictions. It looks at the effect of climate change on infectious diseases and mental health. The link is provided at the bottom. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Ifat and Wamek. We are going to hold off on questions, although I already have a few interesting in your findings. But we're going to, everybody, so if you can write your questions on the messages or save it for later when we have the Q&A and discussions. We're now going to move to another area of work which is related to, which actually it's a study that was conducted to look at migration and health issues. And then through that, we're going to be hearing now from Patricia Naina Schwartz. I hope I said that right, Trish. Patricia Trish is a global public health academic specializing in climate change and health. She also has qualifications in health professional education and health promotion. She's based at the Heidelberg Institute of Global Health, and her PhD focuses on the nexus between climate change, migration, and health in Bangladesh and Burkina Faso. So Trish, I'm going to hand over to you now to talk us through your study.
Thank you. I think I shared the slides earlier.
You want me to hold on? Let me then share the slides, and you just tell me to, see my screen? Yeah.
That's it. Great. Thank you.
Okay. I need to make it full mode. Yeah.
Yeah.
But this thing is in my way. What the hell? Yeah. Yeah.
Yep. Great, thank you. I'm just going to present an overview of a study that we conducted, a partnership between the University of Liberal Arts Bangladesh and Heidelberg Institute of Global Health in Germany. This image on the first slide is like an artistic representation of environmental migration. The environmental migration is the red images, and the traditional migration is in grey. So you can see that environmental migration is mainly internal, or it's a short distance. And that's mainly because people whose lives depend on the natural environment tend not to have the resources to move further than within their own countries, or if the migration happens close to a border, then they sometimes cross borders. So with that in mind, the background of this study, which is the next slide. So this study mainly concentrates on climate-related migration. So just as a little bit of background to this, climate change is becoming a more important driver of migration, but it very rarely does climate change act alone. Rather, we know that migration is multi-causal, and climate change acts on existing migration drivers, including social drivers, political, economic, environmental drivers, and demographic drivers. So it kind of acts as what we call a risk amplifier sort of acting in the background of all of these existing migration drivers. So it's difficult sometimes to disentangle these drivers. It's important to recognise that migration can reduce climate-related risk because climate has also been broadly recognised in the literature, migration as climate change adaptation. And what we can see in the literature so far on climate-related migration is there's kind of three narratives. One is that climate-related migration is adaptive in that it can reduce risk, but also the second stream is around migration being maladaptive, in which case it can actually increase risk. And then we kind of see a third narrative, which is about the securitization narrative, in which the migrant is kind of depicted as a threat, and migration is kind of depicted as a problem. So what we do know is that migration and climate are socially mediated impacts of climate change. So they're also known as tertiary impacts of climate change. So you have direct and indirect impacts of climate change. The direct ones relate to extreme weather events, which sometimes cause displacement or extreme heat. And then there are indirect effects that either work through ecological systems, where you see different changes in the patterns of climate-sensitive disease. And then there's the tertiary effects, which are mediated through social systems like migration and conflict. But what we still don't know is what climate policies work well under what conditions and why. If we could just go to the next slide. So the aims and objectives of this study is to explore the experiences of people who move in the context of climate change. So we were interested in people's perceptions and experiences, and these are relevant because those perceptions and experiences lead to migration decisions. We also wanted to amplify the voices of migrants and add nuance to those dominant migration narratives that I mentioned in the background, and to shed light on the real life challenges migrants face in meeting their health needs in the context of climate change. So the research question was really, what do migrants experience concerning climate change, migration and health, and how do they experience it? If we could just go, I've just got a couple of conceptual frameworks. This one was the output of a systematic literature review that I did, looking at 30 years of research on climate change and health and 30 years of research on climate change and migration, and really tried to connect these concepts between the nexus of what we call of climate change, migration and health. In a nutshell, climate change at the top can be both sudden and slow onset hazards that are then mediated through intermediate factors such as age, sex, education, disability, health status, and socioeconomic status, to lead to migration or human mobility effects, which can either be forced or voluntary. So these patterns include displacement, immobility, relocation, and migration. Also, climate change has another impact on health, and the main health impacts that have been studied in this literature include psychosocial issues, malnutrition, infectious disease, injury, mortality, and NCDs. And we also found that food and water security is an important mediator between climate change and human mobility and health. We could just go to the next slide, please. This is another conceptual diagram that was published in The Lancet. It just shows that climate change impacts can be global or local, and they can lead to climate-related mobility. And migration is also connected to climate change impacts in terms of the fact that some migrants move into areas where they face climate change and health risks, and sometimes that's worse than their place of origin. And both of these, this interaction tends to lead to health impacts. The main ones that we've seen in the literature are malnutrition, heat-related illness, waterborne disease, infectious disease, mental health impacts, importantly, and also fatalities. If you could just move to the next slide. So we purposefully selected people who self-identified as moving, at least in part, due to climate reasons or environmental reasons. And we did a series of interviews with migrants living in Bola slum in Dhaka, Bangladesh. We did 58 semi-structured interviews that lasted between 20 and 15 minutes in Bangla, and then translated and transcribed. We also did structured debriefing with the interviewers. And then the analytic method was reflexive thematic analysis, which we conducted using NVivo version 12, and the results. So this is just like a visual of the kind of coding tree that we came up with. And if you start at the bottom, we kind of identified a risk exchange. So this kind of goes against those dominant narratives that migration is either adaptive or maladaptive, it's either successful or unsuccessful. And what we found was that it can be both, and that can play out differently within countries, within communities, and even within households within communities. So downstream from that, the dominant themes were that people exchanged health risks at origin and destination, and they also experienced changing health and healthcare environments. So taking a systems perspective, this study was interesting in terms of how people interacted with the healthcare system. And the changing health status also related to mental health status. And just downstream from that, we saw 9 ways in which these health risks were kind of manifested. And the yellow ones are ones where you might consider that there's there's a possible intervention there that might reduce the risk and increase resilience. So in terms of exchanging health risks at origin and destination, we found that people experienced extreme weather at both origin and at destination. Mainly at origin, it was related to storms, and they had high levels of exposure to those storms, which often destroyed their homes. But even in the destination sites, they were living in informal settlements where they were highly exposed to extreme heat. That was a big concern for the participants in the study. There was a changing health risks related to work and income. So it was, I suppose you could put it in a nutshell by saying people went from income insecurity to income insecurity. Before, when they were working in farming, they were working extremely long hours, and the whether they could earn and whether they could eat really depended on the weather. But also in urban settlements, they had high degrees of income instability and often faced the threat of losing their work at any given time. There was an exchange of risk in the food environment as well, in terms of quality, access, safety, affordability. And sometimes that improved and sometimes it was worse. But generally there was a feeling that the food was not as fresh and not as diverse as in the origin. I probably won't go into all these into too much detail because I don't want to take too much time, but just to say those yellow ones probably pertain more to mental health as well, which is the focus of this session. So we found that social capital diminished, but it was also re-established at the destination. So there was quite a nuance in the interviews here. Some people felt that they were very anonymous in their new destination in an urban environment, whereas others felt very much at home because they had re-established their social network. So many people moved with other people and were able to maintain that social capital, which is a determinant of mental health as well. Changing mental health status was expressed quite indirectly in terms of a lack of peace, a loss of land, a loss of connection to homeland, but also a loss of identity and the feeling of being trapped at destination. And finally, in terms of health systems, QOC stands for quality of care. So there were different interpretations of the quality of care that people received, and lots of migrants experienced barriers to accessing healthcare, which I can go into more detail, but probably it's better to read the paper just to get in the interest of time. So I'll just move on to the next slide. I'll be brief because I don't want to take up other people's time. You can't see this very well, but it just shows on the left, it's a Sankey diagram, and it shows how people's income and employment changed. So mainly you had people that were farmers or that were unemployed or fishermen on the left, and on the right, you can see that there was a diversification of employment and opportunities there, where people became rickshaw pullers, garment workers, labourers, small business owners. You did find that fewer people were unemployed, and this may be reflected that many of the women started working for the first time when they moved to the urban environment, and there were some concerns about childcare when women did work, and sometimes children needed to be left in those informal shelters where they faced different health risks including exposure to extreme heat. So just in conclusion, rather than seeing migration as adaptive or maladaptive, there might be a false dichotomy, and this research suggests that there is rather a risk exchange. So each population and setting needs to be considered on its own merit. This aligns with the latest IPCC AR6 report, where it says that expanding opportunities for mobility can reduce vulnerability for such populations. So in other words, migration can be adaptive and reduce climate-related risk. Social ties can be fractured by migration, yet migration is not always negative for mental health. And I think that's important to also, because I think in public health, we often look at the risks, but we don't often pay enough attention to the protective factors. So of the people that were able to maintain or improve their mental health, what is it that brought about that situation, and is that something where we could intervene and potentially replicate? Migrants face a changing healthcare environment where they face different choices and barriers, and the impression was that there was a very, very complex health environment that people needed to navigate, and that requires a high level of health literacy in terms of where do I go, how do I access these healthcare services, and a lot of the barriers are described in the paper, also in terms of seeing healthcare as a business and a lack of trust with healthcare professionals. And just finally, climate resilient health systems also need to be migrant inclusive if they are to be responsive to increasingly mobile populations. So I suppose that was the main finding of this study, a recommendation to make health systems both climate resilient and migrant inclusive. Thank you.
I'm going to stop sharing that. Thank you so much, Trish. Again, gives us more food for thought as we try and understand how these issues are related and what we can, do to tackle and to design interventions around these. So I'm going to move on to our next presenter, Mahmood Akhtar. Mahmood is a senior research officer at SAJIDA Foundation. She has been working for the last 5 years around climate change adaptation, migration capacity building, and other areas. So she'll be talking about a study that we did from SAJIDA Foundation around climate change and mental health. So Mahmood, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Appa, and hello, everyone. So first I will start with some buzzwords, like what we all know: adaptation, mitigation, loss and damage, NBS, capacity building. We know all of them are like the buzzwords in climate change arena. But the topic we are discussing today hasn't become the focus of discussion yet. However, this is not true that this is not being discussed at all. Many reports of climate change are now highlighting the mental health issues. Keeping this in mind, we conducted a study to address the link between climate change and mental health. My slides are moving.
We're not on the next slide yet. If you have moved to the next slide.
Oh, now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So in our study, we tried to understand the climate risk and vulnerability of marginal groups using the climate risk index and a vulnerability index. And we collected data on mental health issues using DHQ-12. By analyzing the information we collected, we are trying to understand how climate risk and vulnerability can play a vital role in increasing a person's mental stress. Now, the question may come why we are doing research on just focusing on my mental health. This is what I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, is to address the linkage between climate change and mental health. Very few works has been done on this issue in Bangladesh. Some reports say that many people are feeling stressed due to loss of livelihood and hampering their physical health, but no report from Bangladesh has been published yet, after conducting a proper scientific analysis. Moreover, there is still a lack of knowledge about mental health. Like it is hard to define. Many people don't like the term actually mental illness because some people think it is similar to mental disorder, which actually we call in local language pagal. So maybe this is why more research has been done focusing on physical health rather than mental health. So besides finding the linkage between mental stress and climatic events, to knowing the gaps in existing research and to finding opportunities to work in the future, and also to assist in setting up a longer term research project where our research objective. We have selected 2 climate vulnerable areas from the southern region of Bangladesh for our initial study. One is Gabura, from where many people are forced to migrate to other places due to climate change and disaster impact. And another place that we chose is Mongla, which is itself a climate vulnerable area, but becoming a well-known place as migrant-friendly cities for having labor-based job opportunities. So during our study, we have conducted 775 household survey from both Mongla and Gabura. We talked with local and national level stakeholders to get insights about it, and also conduct some focus group discussions to get locals' point of view. Through this slide, we can see the problems related to disaster and climate change. In both sides, like Gabura and Mongla, cyclones, floods, waterlogging, and salinity institutions were the main problems due to disaster and climate change. In terms of vulnerability, livelihood, sanitation facilities, homes, roads, physical health, mental health were the more vulnerable areas due to climate change and disaster issues. And through this slide, let me make it. Yeah, is it clear for everyone?
Yeah,
Sorry,
yeah, we can see it.
very big data. So through this slide, we were trying to show the correlationship between vulnerability and climate change. And here we can see feeling depressed, losing confidence, all are very coming up very negative way due to climate change impact. We from our research, we found that due to disaster, their home and road livelihoods all are hampering. But if we look for mental stress, losing confidence, feeling depressed, unable to face problems, they are actually interrelated to livelihood, related to disaster, salinity institution or sanitation facilities rather than house or road. So from this data, we can feel that their depression is very related to their economical condition, also their physical condition, physical health and other sorts of disaster issues. So all of them were from our household level data. But as I mentioned earlier, we also conducted some sorts of national and local level stakeholders meetings. So from one of our stakeholders meeting, we found that we always from a local hospital, health worker shared with us that they always get a lot of patients with mental health problems, but they can't do anything with them since they are providing only physical healthcare services. They don't have any expertise to provide mental health support. from one of our FGD discussion, like focus group discussion, we found that they don't have anyone to discuss about mental stress. They only talk about mental disorders with one another because it's very visible. Everyone can feel it, but in terms of the stress, like depression one or anxiety one, no one can feel it, and they also feel shy to share it with others. So before going to the next step, I will say, as we are getting only like 7 minutes to share our findings, so we were not able to share all the data, but we are planning to share our data in larger audience, so publishing some peer-reviewed journals. We are also planning to organize some like frank dialogue with both national and international levels stakeholders to produce some policy briefs. Also, like we are planning to share our thoughts in international platform like COP27, where we can discuss about what sorts of policy we need to implement for ensuring mental health services in climate vulnerable region. Also, like in terms of action research, we are planning to provide some sorts of training, mainly for the local climate experts or climate champions on mental health first aid issues or para-counseling issues. Like through this point, actually, we are trying to find out some local youth to whom we can scaling up like his or her knowledge in terms of mental health issues. We are also working with our SAJIDA's mental health team to provide context on mental health needs of climate vulnerable communities. And with them, we are planning to develop our apps. Actually, they already have apps, which is known as Sujan apps, but we're trying to modify it for climate vulnerable people, like to interlink with climate change and mental stress. And then we will provide some training for the trainers from local community on this service. And then we're planning to hire someone from local level who can visit daily basis in household level to collect their data on both mental and physical health. Yeah, this is for, all from my end, but as like Samia Appa were with like us in our research, I would like to request her to add some points here if I miss anything too.
No, that's great. Thank you so much, Mawa. Perfect time as well. Thank you. No, you covered pretty much. I mean, as Mahmoud mentioned, we have just finished the study, so there's still a lot of work to look at disaggregated data, look at impact on women versus the impact on men, as well as this is all aggregated from Gabura and Mongla, but we know it's completely different context. One is more on the front line. In Mongla, we're working with more climate migrant population. So I'm pretty sure we're going to be, as we analyze the data further, we hope to get a better understanding, on some of the nuances, the changes between the areas, between different groups of people. Additionally, as she mentioned in the last slide, one of the core, the climate change program at SAJIDA Foundation is new, but what their strength lies in wider healthcare, mental health care. They have hospitals and they have counselors. So we want to work with their team to try and get them contextualized to make them understand, the kind of vulnerabilities and stresses faced in the communities we work in, and at the same time use their expertise to really design interventions that we can then apply in the areas we work in. So I'm just going to go to our last presenter. We have a young researcher, Mohammad Badru Zaman. He is a recent graduate and he's been working both at ULab and now also will be joining SAJIDA working with some of these climate vulnerable communities on different research projects. And from within that, so the projects research he was part of as a student the last 2 years has been, around migration, climate change, gender climate impacted communities. But from there, he was able to draw out some of these mental health issues that we're discussing today. So Saman, over to you. You
Yes,
very briefly tell us.
I'm going to share my screen and begin the presentation. Okay, so good evening to everyone. I'm going to present on my paper titled as Bangladesh Needs to Factor Mental Health into Disaster Response Policies. This will be a short presentation. I'm going to share my research background with you, then I end with the, sharing the key findings of my research. So the problems, as we have been hearing from the previous presenters, that there is lack of mental health data in terms of climate change. So when monsoon starts, this is a common phenomenon that floods and erosion happens, and people only talk about the materialistic loss and damages of the disasters, and people do not or we can say that pay less attention to the mental health issues suffered by the communities from these disasters. This is particularly because of the lack of mental health data in this research, which also implies that there is lack of policy intervention in this aspect. And so considering this scope of work and the attention needs to be paid, my research objective was to add to early stage research suggesting prevalence of mental health issues among disaster affected population that require policy interventions. So I conducted the study in 4 locations. These are Naya Chor, which is in Kurigram, Chor Poli in Tangail, Chor Solimabad in Sirajganj, and Manikdar in Bogura. All four locations are highly vulnerable to erosion and flood. These are located along the course of the Jamuna River. And this was the qualitative study. I conducted 10 FGDs to obtain the data, and there were 80 participants in the study. So these are my key findings in bullet points. So the prominent conditions, mental health conditions, I found that these are anxiety, depression, and PTSDs. And the main stressors behind these conditions are loss and damage, plus bad experiences associated with riverbank erosion. And I also found that women were the most vulnerable group that are to suffer from mental health. And one interesting finding was that some conditions can be life-threatening and require immediate support. And lastly, the DRR actions are rarely nearly absent or deeply inadequate in these communities. So there are multiple factors that contribute to the rise of anxiety among the affected people. These are fear of losing assets, fear of losing identity, and being permanently displaced. So one can say that anxiety is a healthy response to any disaster. This helps people to survive, to save their assets, but this becomes problematic when this starts to disrupt their daily activities. So this is what happened in my study. This is what I found in my study, that anxiety gets triggered during the onset of the monsoon, and this severely disrupts their daily lives, even before any material damage occurs. And since land and property are symbols of social status, the potential material losses are a source of particularly high anxiety, because they also carry social weight. So I have taken 2 quotes from the paper. If you look at the left of the screen, to the quote number 1, it says, "We fear losing our houses and lands. Everything is over if you lose your shelter." This is a male talking from Kurigram. So we can sense that sense how people are anxious about losing their assets, that, which are symbols of social status, and they become anxious, very anxious that they cannot operate in their daily lives. And there is also another excerpt. A young man from Chorpoli recalled the discrimination he faced when migrating temporarily to Dhaka. So he says, "At home, we know everyone. We can at least share our feelings when we are sad. In Dhaka, nobody knows us. We have to live in slums. People in slums don't want us to stay there. They call us in abusive language, and they say we are stealing their work." So this again explains their fear of losing ties with their relatives and loved ones, and also being permanently displaced, which again constitutes to the rise of anxiety. And while many people can overcome from their conditions, but there are few people who suffer for longer periods. In my study, I found that 9% of the respondents suffered from mental health issues for longer periods. Of these, most had been affected by flooding around 6 times. And the problems they were facing were flashbacks, feeling helpless, suffering from sleep disturbance, and developing pessimistic attitude. In quote number 3, a woman from Nature described how these stressful events affect their mental health, saying that people experience flashbacks long after the floods and erosion are over. As she says, "It is heartbreaking to see your house being taken away. We cannot forget it. This haunts us like a bad dream." And there is another quote, number 4, an elderly man from...
I don't think you have to read the whole thing out. It's a long one, but yeah, we can see it on the screen.
Slide then.
1 more minute, yeah.
Yes. So the interesting finding I found was that some health issues can be life-threatening and require immediate interventions. In case of materialistic loss and damage, in times of disaster, local authorities mitigate loss and damage through disaster reduction programs in times of emergency. However, health problem can arise anytime after a natural disaster and may require urgent treatment. So this is a quote that says, I had a respondent who said that his mother developed a seizure condition after losing a lot of assets from erosion. And this one day this happened while she was working near a pond. So it was very scary for them. She could have fallen in the pond and it could be fatal. So about the disaster response measures, these are, as they said, actions remain nearly absent, failing to address needs such as healthcare as well as food and drinking water. And the few initiatives that are carried out are deeply inadequate because their specific needs are not heard of. And these also, this not only affect their healthcare provision, but even the construction of embankments along the riverbank, which constitutes the first line of defense against flooding. So, end of the slide. So, in conclusion, I would like to say that better and more granular field research is priority if Bangladesh hopes to address the practical and psychological needs of its riverine communities. And also, it is important that locals should also be actively involved in shaping policies and intervention programs to facilitate their adoption, particularly in sensitive fields such as mental health. So thank you for listening. That was my time.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing again another region that is also highly vulnerable, but we can see that the various different difficulties and challenges faced there and how it affects health, mental health, and other areas as well. So thank you again to our, we have heard from different studies and different findings. And we would now like to move to our discussants who are here to talk about their experience from being working in the field, not in academic, but working with these communities at a closer level. So I would like to invite Ms. Farah Kabir. She's the current country director of ActionAid Bangladesh. She has research experience and a number of publications, especially on women in politics. She very illustrious career, which I'm not going to more details, but I'd just like to say Farah is again a great mentor, and we're learning a lot from her and the work that ActionAid Bangladesh has been doing around these issues that we're trying to discuss today, around mental health, gender, climate change, and resilience. So I'd like to hand over to Farah to share her thoughts with us.
Thank you, Samia. Actually, the past hour, I was learning and I was listening attentively because all the contributions, presentations were very interesting. And, at one point I was thinking, what can I add? From where shall I start? What do I bring to this table? And so I thought, okay, so maybe if I share our experiences on the ground, and, we've talked about climate change, adaptation, coping mechanisms, and frequent disasters. And, your colleagues have discussed the mental health issue. So let me first share with you that, post Cyclone Sidr, we were all engaged in humanitarian response. And the first thing that when you want to respond is where's the water, where's the food? Then you look at wash, sanitation, right? And mental health, way back in 2007 and 8, where you would have to go down the hierarchy and find it somewhere. But it was quite clear as we were working on that the stress, the empathy part of it, and continuous, the exposure to such challenging situations, conditions on the ground impacts all of us, and it impacts in different ways. So we were working for the response, and some of my colleagues, because of their enthusiasm and their commitment, worked nonstop. And I was there on the ground, but I was obviously privileged being the country. They would say, no, you go now, you go and rest, but they were there. My first experience was that there was a family, there was this father who had lost 7 members, of 6 of his children and his wife. And while I was working there hands-on, I was going to be providing food and water. What do I say? How does he grieve? And what can be done at that point, I felt so powerless. I felt so small that there's nothing. I mean, I know it's because of climate change. I know it's frequent disasters. But right at that moment, for this individual or for that community, these things, what did it really mean? And then from there, when I was coming back, I found that my colleagues, because of lack of water, they had not consumed water whole day, and that they were at high risk of dehydration and so on. And they were also traumatized with that. So the first thing I did after coming back is no one's going to work for more than 5 days at a stretch. And you come back, you need rest, and you need to talk to somebody. We didn't have para-counselors or counselors, or we didn't have the skills to. So I immediately went to Dhaka University, to the Department of Psychology, Psychiatry, and said, can we have some para-counselors also working side by side for the community and for my colleagues, and so this is the learning on the ground. post Ayla and Mahashen and all that, when I was in Munchiganj and in Sundarban, everything had been destroyed, and there were just few stacks of bamboos on which the children had been placed, and the parents, particularly the mother, was trying to get some water. So I went from Khulna to Dakov and some of these places. It took me an hour and a half on a speedboat. So it's that far into Sundarbans. And when I was coming back, I sat in the speedboat and I cried because I felt that in this century, in this today, technology, space, development, everything, we can't support these people. I myself went through the trauma, and and I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who to talk to. So I can identify as a frontliner, but it's never this. It's not going to be the same as the community, as the individuals who are displaced, who have lost everything. I was reading about this young boy who was 9, Robiul's story, that they were in a climate vulnerable area, and the good intentions of the authorities was that to ask them to move, but the family did not want to move from their home. It was their home. It was what they knew as an address, as the way they had grown up. And after repeated notices and so on, they refused to move. So they literally had to be dragged out of there. And this 9-year-old Robiul went through huge trauma because he was leaving his home. He was getting displaced, and he didn't understand that it was in their interest. So he developed stomach aches, other problem, and they took him to the hospital. They couldn't find anything wrong physically, but he still was in a lot of pain, and they were trying to move him to another, and ultimately that young boy of 9 died. So this is what happens to us while we are working on the ground. And when we try to come back and look at those who had migrated to the slums, and all the research findings, I can relate to them. The fear of having to leave, and then the desire to find an alternative, the aspiration to build another life, another world, then coming to the slums or wherever you can. And before coming to the slums, when they were moving, the first responders are the family members. And then, the people are generous, they open their doors, there's flooding, there's waterlogging, there's been cyclone, you let your relatives stay. But if you yourself are not in a condition with disposable income or well off, the compassion fatigue sets in very quickly. And those who have moved in can feel it, they suffer through the loss of dignity. Then they try to find an alternative. They move to the slums, and they come to the slums or informal settlements. And if they don't have a contact, that means they don't have the social capital. And they are so vulnerable, and all that has come up from the presentation. I can relate to it because I've spoken and worked on the ground with these people. And then, even though the slum dwellers who are already there have experienced it, are themselves relatively vulnerable, are not welcoming because of the threat that they feel that the new groups will take over and they will displace. And there's the power dynamics. And that impacts all those who migrate, but it has a greater impact on women and girls. Their vulnerability increases. They're at a higher risk in that sense. And so I think from 2007 to now, we have come a long way in terms of at least acknowledging that there is that mental stress, there is anxiety, there is depression, and we need to look into it. But easier said than done, because even in normal circumstances, you don't have the facilities. If you take the per capita para-counselors or professionals to support in the area of mental health, we are in dire strait. On top of that, when you are being displaced or you're going through this, you're suffering disasters and have to relocate, and you've lost whether it is material well-being or your emotional and social capital, then how do you support them? So I think I would like to conclude on the issues of we need to plan better. We need to come up with policy briefs. We need to provide solutions of how, whether it's the government, it's the UN facilities or international leadership, that it's high time they invest in this, not just the rhetorics of it, because we have Mental Health Day, we have Autism Day, we have the Convention on People with Disability, but what actually have we done? And when it comes to people with disability, it is even more pathetic. Because in such circumstances, you can't move the wheelchair, they lose their assistive devices, they are not mobile, they're dependent on their caregivers. It is so difficult that I would like to see that out of this exercise today, out of our meeting and conferences, we come up with a few concrete plans and we put it out there for our government and for the international community. And mental health, should be prioritized because it's an issue of rights and dignity, but it's also about the capacity of the community and to making them self-reliant, because we don't want to see people dependent. It's not an issue of charity, it's an issue of right and justice. So that requires and that demands that we invest in investment. Again, I would repeat that easier said than done. We need to find some interim and middle solutions, interim options. And, if people are traumatized and if you are from a poor family, the adults are busy trying to find the income, trying to find food, trying to find water. I remember after CEDAW in Kuakata, we had organized workshops with young artists from the Arts College of Dhaka. And what we were trying to do is that the parents were busy trying to collect the relief packages and the children were left alone, or the younger children were left with an older sibling and who was equally traumatized, but had to take the responsibility of childcare because the parents were so we engaged with them, we did workshops, we did painting and music and so on. So we need to also remember that mental health and well-being can be addressed at different levels. It doesn't always become severe where you need medication and hospitalization. There can be cultural initiatives, there can be community initiatives, and the best thing is sports. In education, sports, these are a very important part of it. Now, if you're in waterlogged situation, my suggestions might not make sense. If you are in a island, broken roads, and you can't communicate, you might say, all this sounds very good, but how do we organize? So I would like to say that communities themselves cope. Communities also find the alternatives. And are we listening to them? Are we investing at that level? Are we providing minimal, very simple tools? I've seen how by providing football, the crayons and game, little toys, it made a difference in the lives of the children, because we work with children as part of a sponsorship program, child sponsorship program. For the women, the most important thing is to be able to provide the water, look after the health and food of their family. It is so critical for them that they don't look after themselves. So there has to be investment in where we do counseling for the women, that if you are well, if you're mentally, physically well, then you can look after, we understand that it is your priority. So we need that. And then in these situations, there is an increase in gender-based violence. And if there's an increase in gender-based violence, where do you go? So my next recommendation is we need to create safe spaces and refuge. This is not to suggest that we separate the families, but if it comes to a situation where a woman repeatedly suffers from violence, then a refuge is a better option. And if there is a refuge, we have to make sure that we also create spaces for children. We don't want women to move alone if they have children. I mean, it's a decision that they should be making. It's not a decision based on the infrastructure or the facilities that we are offering. So this is how, I would conclude that while we have identified the problems, you have done studies, the 3 research presentations, so we can map out the different places, Dhaka, Bhola, Gabura, and other places. And definitely we can come up with a policy brief and suggestions, which we can put forward to our policymakers and the legislators. And thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Appa. That's a number of actually recommendations that we would definitely like to take forward from this session, and exactly starting with the policy, with just what we have heard so far and discussed. I know we're running a bit behind time, but I'm just going to invite our we have some really interesting questions put out there, but if I could just invite Kate Barneyhausen to just say a few words. She's a health researcher also at the Institute of Public Health, Heidelberg Institute of Global Public Health. Kate, are you still here with us?
Yeah, hi there.
Hi.
Yeah, thanks everyone so much for the wonderful presentations. Wamak, Ifat, Trish, Mahmouda, Mohammed, and thank you, Samaya, for inviting us. So many in-depth and complex issues arose from these presentations. Lack of services, whether influencing mood, identity, shelter, where do we seek support, stress, sadness, loss, daily life disruptions. And I was thinking to myself, having worked in Bangladesh and working with some wonderful students at the moment, looking at well-being and mental health, what's this kind of red thread that runs through these presentations? What's the one thing that I'm grabbing onto to say, okay, this is something that we can do or we could use. And of the many red threads I think that we're seeing, one is definitely information. And for me, this is really key. And coming from, this infodemic that's come from COVID and mixed messages and not giving people the right information or enough information or information to act on that's context relevant and context specific. I think, in Bangladesh, if only 8% of people are able to access mental health or wellbeing services, then there's this huge and open platform that we have access to and can really develop and mold in a way that's useful for the populations that need to use it. And I think that's what was just touched on before, making it that community level, that kind of frontline grassroots approaches to supporting people with their well-being and their mental health. And, the presentation about mood being related to weather, as a British person, I think lots of us would say that the rain definitely influences our mood in the UK. And that resonates with me, particularly in relation to young people that, go through these changes in their well-being and their state of mental health. And do they know, are they aware that climate change is also contributing to how they feel and how they think and how they act? And if giving young people that information, is that a support, that they didn't have before? Making people aware of those specifics is really important. And then, in relation to Trish's presentation, health literacy, what can we give people? What information can we provide? Is it that talking, these simple things, that talking can help, walking can help, direction to the closest clinic with a doctor that won't charge you X amount of money, just to sit there and speak to them about how you feel and the stress that's in your life. these, where can you go and who are those people? I think that health literacy is really key. This idea of frontline local support. And I think that's really where we can make a difference with, if we haven't got endless funds and limited resources, this is where we can really harness the community and build things that are relevant for them at that time and at that place. And to acknowledge that those services need to be as dynamic as the climatic environment that these people live in, and need to adapt and address the issues that people see and feel as they come up, I think is really key. So I think to conclude, we have to be really careful that we don't give wrong messaging, and that we can really give messaging that is accessible and relevant and is done in the right way. And within these migrant communities, and making sure that these services are migrant inclusive, I think we have a really open platform in which to do that. And we should all come together and build something really good for that.
Great. Thank you so much, Kate. I mean, what can I say? It's exactly, there's just so many different areas and threads here that we can pick up on, but definitely we'll be picking up both from what you discussed and Parapa. We are really running behind time, and I know we're going to have Q&A first, and then we would like to invite Dr. Silmul to come and say a few words at the closing, but I know Dr. Haq has other engagement after this. So sir, can I ask you, would you like to speak now to us, or?
Yes, please,
Yeah?
if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
I need to leave in a few minutes.
That's exactly what I thought. Yes.
Great. Thank you very much, Samiato, for inviting me to this session. I've been listening in to most of it, not the beginning. I missed the beginning, but it's extremely interesting. And let me just share a few thoughts from my perspective, which is not a mental health knowledge expertise at all. But in the climate change literature on vulnerability and adaptation, which I am more familiar with, the issue of mental health did not used to be addressed or recognized even until very recently. I think the sixth assessment report is really the first time where we have some reasonably good assessments of mental health. And the reason for this is not difficult to understand. Mental health tends to fall by the wayside. And this is true not just in poor countries like Bangladesh, but even in rich countries. I was in the UK for the last few months, and one of the discoveries is the mental health problems that the lockdown imposed on people. And it came out very late. It wasn't something that, people complained, and we know anecdotal evidence, but really severe mental health problems in a rich country like the United Kingdom from stresses that were unusual and difficult to deal with, and became more difficult in particular circumstances where elderly people were on their own, families couldn't get together. And so these are not necessarily poor people's problems. They are everybody's problems. And they don't tend to get picked up very easily because, it's not as if a person thinks that I have a mental problem, I need to go see a psychologist or a psychiatrist. It festers, it causes mental stress, but people don't self-diagnose, they don't understand, they have no other ways of understanding it. And so it tends to be a very neglected area in disaster management or in vulnerability assessments or in adaptation as well. But now that it's being recognized, I feel this is a great opportunity for us to do more. Good researchers like yourselves and your colleagues to invest in doing the research, finding out what the problems are, but more important than just finding the problems, also looking at solutions. What are ways in which we can deal with these problems, relying on social networks, relying on social capital, relying on some level of mental health workers, and then formal mental health workers as a sort of last resort. and seeing what can be done in terms of investing in those capabilities and those services in NGOs. You know, by and large, our development NGOs don't even take it into account. As Farah gave very vivid example of, you know, the workers, our own workers, we stress them and we don't think of it as stress. You know, make them work 7 days a week all day long, and it causes stress. But we don't you know, realize it ourselves. And I must plead guilty. I stress my young colleagues all the time. I put too much stress on them because I'm a workaholic, and I make everybody into a workaholic, which is very bad, and I accept that. So the point I'm making is that this is a virgin territory for doing research, and doing research not just, as I said, of the problem, but solutions to the problem, and then testing them, trying them to see what works and what doesn't work, because not everything will work, and not everything works everywhere. It might work, one thing might work in one place, it may not work in another place. So we need to be testing these and making them happen. And I'm glad that SAJIDA Foundation is taking this seriously. We need somebody in Bangladesh to take it seriously, and then bring together others who may be similarly interested and similarly inclined to work on this, and then take it further in terms of raising awareness about the issue, and then finding solutions to deal with it, and encouraging pilots to experiment and find solutions, and then scaling up on those pilots. So just one last point, you know, putting it in a very climate change jargon context, as Mahmouda said, in the climate change jargon, we use the term loss and damage to actually include something called non-economic loss and damage. And mental stress and mental problems fall very clearly under that category of non-economic loss and damage. And in the loss and damage literature, of which there isn't much, but there is growing amount of research on loss and damage, the non-economic loss and damage is the neglected part. There's a lot more work going on economic loss and damage, because it's easy to count, you know, economic losses from crop losses or infrastructure damage, etc. But non-economic loss and damage is much, much more difficult to find qualitative measures of and demonstration of. So this would really qualify as a good research on non-economic loss and damage if you couch it in climate change terms going forward. I hope that's useful. I'll stop there.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially, particularly this last point, I was trying to think how our work can contribute to the, you know, growing need for understanding loss and damage as well. Thank you so much for joining us. And yes, we do, you know, this is an area that SAJIDA does feel very passionate about. And as you know, we're very, myself, Mahmouda, how the research can actually fit into, you know, feed into, action on the ground. So I hope this is really the start of that conversation with so many other like-minded people who are here, and we would now like to hear from, I know you mentioned you do have to go.
I have to leave, I'm afraid. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And yeah, we'll be continuing the dialogue and taking this forward from today's conversations. Thank you so much. We're just going to take up 5 more minutes. So I know we already have the first question that was asked by Hafizur Rahman. Is he here with us? If he might have.
I have to leave. So
okay, sure, Abba, thank you so much for joining us. We will be continuing these conversations and these discussions forward, and you know, we will be in touch as we design policy briefs around from everything that was said today, and continuing on with our work around this. Thank you so much for joining us today.
And thank you for inviting me. Good night.
Good night. Yes, Mahmouda, can I pass over to you, or sorry, to Julfikar to ask that last question of our, I think Hafizur Rahman he's not here, or we can't, can they talk, or do you have to read out?
The attendance, like from the attendance list, they can't like say anything. They can just write.
Oh, I see.
So we need to read on behalf of them, and then someone from us can answer this question.
Oh, okay, that's how it works, right? Okay, so the question was, how do people adapt their mental stress after environmental stressor happens, since they're not provided any support? That is a good question, and that is something that we really want to start around this dialogue. How do we start providing the support? As Mahmouda mentioned in her talk, one of the ways we are doing it is there's still that need to raise awareness and literacy and knowledge around what constitute these mental health issues. So from Sajida, we're going to be starting just initially mental health first aid training, and following that, training of trainers to become para counselors, within the communities that we're working with, to understand some of these issues, both in migrant populations as well as frontline staff. And then hopefully from our action research, we plan to address that question. If anybody else, so we have Kate here still, who's been part of the research that Trish shared. Kate, would you want to answer how else we can start to provide any kind of mental health support?
Yeah, so I think from the work that a student I'm working with, Kira, has done, it's really about firstly identifying, how people are thinking about their mental health and well-being to begin with. So people that we spoke to definitely did not use the term depression, did not say that they were mentally unwell. So the ways that you would address those issues have to be different to how you would say to someone that's depressed, okay? And I think to begin with, the local coping mechanisms, the local support strategies that people are talking about and using are really key. And some of that is very much linked to the environment from Kira's work, talking about how being around the environment that makes you feel safe and comfortable is a very good approach to begin with. Being around your family, depending on whether or not they are an added stressor, and talking to people, and these kind of local support networks that could exist or could be built on. And then, yeah, I think, like I said in the discussion, I think awareness of that these issues are real, and just because you can't necessarily touch them or feel them, they're there, and there's something that people struggle with, and acknowledging that feelings of stress and sadness are a real burden, and they impact the way you are day to day. And ensuring that people have that information, that they know that this isn't odd and it's not weird and we shouldn't stigmatize it. And it's something that we and the community can acknowledge and move forward to together. If Kira could speak, I'm sure she could give you a list of coping strategies that she has from her latest paper. But I think that's something that we can certainly share with the organisation. Yeah, and that's the real truth of the matter is that these services aren't going to be magically funded by anyone, and it's going to have to be frontline local to begin with.
Right. Are we able to add Kira here, Mahmouda, or is that too late? No, okay, that's fine. We will be continuing these discussions forward on how do we, but one of the key things that's going to be coming out from today's meeting is, we are looking into writing up a policy brief from the different studies, what they have found, what are some of the key suggestions, recommendations that we want to take forward to policymakers. But on the side, there's still so much work to be done, as you said, around awareness, around literacy on these, capacity building of frontline staff working, as well as the community champions that we want to work with, who can then reach out to the wider community. I think we'll just take one last question, and then we do have to close the session today. There was a question around the gender. So this is from Amanda Carico. She wanted to know about the gender differences. So could they expand on the patterns that emerged in the data? They mentioned gender differences, and then also about their thoughts about measures detect mental illnesses, in males versus females. That was really my first questions to the Ifat and Wamek about, interestingly, they found more in male, whereas more, mental health issues, whereas we found more in females. And so, unfortunately, our presenters, because we do have run out of time, did have to leave, but that's something that we will, cross-check and I guess more, try to understand.
May I add one point here?
Absolutely. Yeah, go ahead.
So like as our target audience, like target groups were from like climate migrant families. So they were sharing their experience that the male member, when they go outside for like as a seasonal migrant, so that time female are like feeling triple burden on them. Like they have to look after their family, their kids, and they also need to like cook for them. They need to earn for their family, and also the security purpose, they need to take the lead to protect their family. So this is why they feel more stressed than male members here. So from our like both region, from Mongla and Gabura, the same sorts of answer we found from them. But in terms of Mongla, actually, the main reason was like they are breaking their social network and moving to a new place, and main members are like able to mix with the groups easily because they're going outside, like sitting on a tea stall. But the female members, they're like feeling a very lonely life in a new place. Right. So this is another issue where, and we also there was like another comment in the chat box that we also need to consider disability during our training sessions. So I would like to answer in that comment. Like we have that sort of plan. Like we are we are planning to provide training for disabled person, but our main focus is not only for disabled, the persons who are like feeling depressed or anxiety, like they can't express their feelings as disability way. We will also work for them. We will try to reduce the root cause, like we will try to reduce the root cause of the mental stress. So this is how we are planning to take initiatives. Yeah.
Great.
You want to add?
Thank you, Mahmoud. No, I think we do have to finish up today. We have run out, but thank you, everyone. Thank you to our presenters, our discussants, to all of you for still being with us 15 minutes past our session. It is almost 10 p.m. here where we are. So on that note, we are going to bring to a close today. Thank you for joining us, but watch this space because we are going to be continuing these dialogues, and we hope if you're interested, do reach out to us, on how you can be involved, whether, and we plan to have create more platforms to have these discussions, obviously sharing it through info briefs, policy briefs, as well as try to find some solutions, as Dr. Haq mentioned, as Parapa mentioned, how do we, address these issues already identified from the research that was presented today. So on that note, I wish everybody good evening, good night, and bring our session to a close. Thank you very much for being with us.